Now recording. So, this is review. We are going to be doing review of the course material as it's been presented so far in preparation for our final exam and also in preparation for the quote-unquote mock test which we are having next week. So, just to go back over the schedule, the thing that we're going to be doing next week in class, the first half of this will be a simulated testing environment. I will give you a test which is not a simulation, but it is a simulation in the sense that it's not worth any marks. We will write the test. We will then, with the second half of the time slot, take the test up. And hopefully interesting information can be gleaned for all of you from that process. Please be aware that there are 2 permitted aids during the final exam. The first one is the crib sheet, one 8.5 by 11 double-sided piece of paper upon which you can put anything you like. Someone in the Tuesday section asked me, is there anything we're not allowed to put on the cheat sheet? And I said, Post-it notes. So you're not allowed to put more paper on your paper. You get, the paper you get is the paper you get, but aside from that, you can write anything you please on it.
What if it's not Lisa?
Hey, what? Who? What?
I was wondering, what about someone else's social insurance number? Would that not be allowed on the cheat sheet?
I mean, I'm not going to be checking. Like, honestly, the reason that it's a double-sided cheat sheet is like, I don't want to be bothered like going through the test, during the test, and be like flipping people's pages over, and it's like, oh, you do have something written on this side. It's like, I just wrote that. It's like, I don't want to deal with that, so double-sided. You can have both sides. It's okay. You know, there's not much more you can do with the second side that you can't do with the first if you're sufficiently motivated, right? So, I will reiterate a couple of warnings about cheat sheets. Do not rely on just text dumping everything from the course onto the cheat sheet. Organize the information, summarize the information, include the important stuff, what you believe to be important. This is the most valuable studying you will do for this course. In combination, I recommend this as a study mechanism for every other course you're taking. Well, every other course that has an exam. Probably you don't need to bother with tech writing, am I right? Yeah. So, okie dokie. Are there any questions about the exam? I did announce the time, right? I put an announcement through? Okay. It's Wednesday, am I right? Yeah. I'm still waiting to hear back about how many invigilators we're actually going to be granted, so that might have an effect on which section I decide to put on in which room. But generally, 3 sections will be in one room, and 1 section will be all on its own in another room, and I haven't decided which yet. But all of us will be writing on the 2nd floor of C Wing. You guys know where that is? You know, okay, if you don't, you know the main vestibule with the very small Tim Hortons in it? And then you come towards the McIntyre Theater, and there's this staircase that goes up. It's up that staircase. There's those rooms are basically used by the Justice Studies Department. There's a a couple of very interesting rooms up there. One is like a combat room where they have like dummies you can beat up, and another one is a mock courtroom, which is kind of fun. But yeah, that's where we're going to be writing the exam. No questions? None whatsoever? You're not even a little curious? I suppose we did talk about it for like an hour last week, so probably that answered any questions you had. But I'm going to keep asking.
All right, I have a question for you.
All right.
How long do you think it should take us versus the amount given? Like, I know you
Ooh.
said that Java, you know, you don't want it to be that same approach of just writing.
I haven't timed myself, but it's like the general rule of thumb is like you should you should have 4 times the writing time I do on any test I set. That's kind of like the general rule. So coding is always tricky, but that's a toughie. Let me put it to you this way. I would expect any student who was kind of like, let's say like a nominal like B level performance, right? Someone with a B level performance who's not like, you know, going over their solutions 3 or 4 times, and like someone who's like, you know, keeping it moving, shall we say. I would estimate you should probably be able to finish the exam in 2 out of the 3 hours. That being said, you know, there's no metric that varies more from person to person than that one. Although there are some like historic patterns, of course. If you see anybody leave before the time is half done, only one of 2 options is there. They either got perfect because they're an ultra genius, or they quit and didn't answer a substantial portion of the test. And it's more often that second one. So to an extent, the sort of early leavers will mostly be people who failed the test. I'd say roundabout, you know, a little bit later you start running into people who are like, okay, grades are starting to go up, people are giving me complete solutions, right? It's kind of like, I think, kind of people kind of in 2 categories who generally will stay the full time regardless as to how, well, 3 categories. People who stay the full time regardless as to, like, you know, well, people who just stay the full time. Number 1, you've got like the ultra keeners who want to make sure every, you know, I is dotted and T is crossed, and will use every scrap of available time they have on the test, right? That's a category of person. You're kind of like B to C level performance, you know, doing okay enough to not like kind of give up, but at the same time, you know, well, maybe I'll adjust that to like maybe like make a low C kind of territory. Someone who's like knows enough to continue on with the test, but not quite enough to be able to finish it promptly, right? Someone who kind of struggles with the recall and that sort of thing. People kind of in the D range will typically be early leavers. And the other type of person who stays right till the final end is like the person who knows almost nothing, but maintains the fervent hope that by staring at the page for an additional hour, it will come to them. That sometimes happens to some degree, but it's rare. It's rare for your brain to sort of click on in the half hour remaining in the test. So there's more answer than I think you were asking for.
Great.
Let me put it to you a different way. I have although I missed the opportunity to like do the thing the college likes and say like on the test, oh, this test has been designed for less time than the full time. They like to see that for like UDL, right? Universal Design for Learning. It's like one of the things they like. I forgot to do that, but I have actually kind of designed the test to be a bit shorter, because it's pass-fail, right? I want all of you to have as much time as you need to answer all of the questions I ask. So yeah, I want you to be able to have a good chew on these questions. But yeah, the exam, I've kind of intended it to be a little bit on the shorter side. That doesn't necessarily mean it's easier, right? But you will find it significantly less writing than Java, at least. But then again, that's also kind of the nature of the language, right? But yeah. Did I tell this class that I'm doing this thing on the practice test of like telling you how many lines of code the solutions are? Yeah. Ooh, I need to write a note to myself. I need to check that. I actually submitted the print job for the final exams yesterday. It's not too late to adjust something. There we go. So, any other questions about the exam? Shall we start in with the review then? Very good. So, first and foremost, the default setting of this review session is me going through module documents, picking some topics, and reviewing them with you. That is the default. You could say that is the default value of the argument which we are providing. That is only what will happen in the event that I don't have any active questions from the audience. So, if anybody wants anything reviewed, please let me know right now. Does anybody have anything to review? Any topics you want to throw on the pile? I've done 2 of these review sessions, and neither of them was quite enough to do the whole course. So if you want something covered, and you want to make sure it's covered, let me know. Yes?
Well, in my case, I would like we can go again through the fetch request, get and pause.
Fetch request
Yes.
for get and post? You just want help with your assignment, don't you? I'm kidding, of course. Okay, fair enough. Anybody else have anything they want to throw on the pile? Oh yes, Bootstrap. Anything else? JSON. Anything else? Okay, fair enough. So, let's start start at the beginning. Fetch requests. So, a couple of notes on fetch requests in general. What is the purpose of a fetch request? Why do we need fetch requests? What can they do that everything else we've studied can't?
You can update the document without having to re-download the whole page.
You can update the document without having to re-download the whole page. Yes, precisely so. All of the other mechanisms we have for sending requests, HTTP requests, URL address bar, clicking on a link, submitting a form, all of these trigger page reload. Sometimes we don't want to reload the page. Sometimes we like our data where it is. So, fetch requests. AJAX stands for
Asynchronous JavaScript.
and,
XML.
there we go, asynchronous JavaScript and XML. So, here is the quick summary of how you send a GET request via AJAX. We use fetch, the fetch function. The first thing specified is the remote resource we are trying to fetch. In many cases, this will be a PHP script, but it works on plain text as well. And things like images. foo.php. In order to send GET parameters, we reconstruct the query string that you see in URLs. So, query strings begin with a question mark. Key equals value. And key equals value. These parameters will be picked up by the server as GET parameters. For a fetch request, we also generally include, in the options object, credentials include. I'm going to leave a bit of space. So after our fetch request, we then break the data that we received out of the response object using two calls to the then method. The first one we use to select what the form of the incoming data shall be. Response gets response dot text. This can also be JSON. We didn't really talk about it in class, but this can also be blob data. You guys know what blob data is? It's binary data. So if you request like an image or a sound file or something of that nature, the MIME type is typically blob. Don't ask me why. I don't know why they chose that name. Probably because programmers, generally speaking, are known for their senses of humor. So, it's important to program computers in as silly a manner as possible. That is the most important thing. So, that's the first one. You basically select whichever of these is appropriate to the type of data you expect to receive from the server. In practice, most of the time this will be JSON. But, you know, you should be aware of the options. After that, we break this out once again. And write a callback function. This function will execute only once the response from the server has been received and that response decoded. So that is a GET request. So far, so good? So now, let's see what changes when we want to do a POST request. First and foremost, the query parameters attached to the URL are GET parameters. If we want to send this information by POST, we must remove them in order to create a POST request. In reality, we are going to be attaching these parameters to the body of the request. But we need to expand our options here. So the default method for requests in general is GET. But now that we are sending by POST, we need to say we're sending by POST. Method gets POST. POST. There we go. Further, we need to attach the actual data to the inside of the packet now. To the inside of the packet, not to the header, right? So this information gets slotted in to body : either this string, or if you saved it in a variable called parameters or params, like we did in class, then you throw that variable in. Note that this does not have quotes, it is therefore a variable, right? Now, the final thing is we need to tell the server the manner in which the data has been encoded. We do this with a fairly complicated line that I'm not going to expect you to have memorized. Header, : content, type, : application. Everybody together! x-www-form-url encoded. Yeah, that's right. Good job, everybody. I'm not going to expect you to memorize that. So, on the subject of what you have to memorize and what you don't, in a situation like this, I generally avoid trying to trip you up on memorization of long strings, even if you have a cheat sheet. Memorization of long strings, which, like, if you were just working, you would definitely just look that up, right? You would just look this up, right? Especially as a junior developer. The important principle behind the code is you must specify what the content type is of the parameters. The important takeaway is you must tell the server how to decode the information you sent it. Right? that's a must. You have to know that. You have to know that you need to tell the server how to decode the bloody thing, right? But the particular string by which you do so, that's, you know, that's something that you would look up in practice, right? Good. So that's how you turn a get AJAX request into a post AJAX request. Does that make sense? It probably, it dovetails nicely. I'd like to take a slight side quest here and talk about get versus post in a bit more general terms. If that's acceptable? Good. So, so get versus post then. Get versus post are methods of HTTP requests, right? So let's think about HTTP itself. When we think about network protocols, we are generally thinking in terms of packets, right? You guys talked a little bit about packets in intro networking, I hope? Yeah? So you will know that in a packet there are two primary regions. Do you know what they are?
There's a header.
The header, yep. And body is an acceptable term for it. That's the term that's used in AJAX itself. Body. This is also called the payload. Right? In the sense that ostensibly this is the thing that you really are concerned with transferring. This is the thing you want transferred, right? So in HTTPS, one of those regions is encrypted and the other is not. Which one is encrypted? Everybody at once. 1, 2, 3. The payload. That's correct. The payload is encrypted. So here's a question. Why is it that the header is not encrypted?
Because the routers need to be able to see that, get access to that data to know where to send it off to.
Precisely so. If the header were encrypted, then every node like that header contains the essential routing information that the packet needs to tell switches and routers and all of these things to be able to get that packet through the network, right? So, in theory, you could have the header encrypted if you agreed on an encryption key with every node in the network between yourself and the eventual destination, right? But this means that you would need a separate TLS handshake operation for every node that you pass through in the network. And let me tell you, you can, in some cases, pass through many nodes in the network before reaching your destination. Further, this, if that's the same encryption key as the payload, you've basically given away what the payload encryption key is to half the internet, right? Including, including a bunch of, you don't know who the middlemen are, right? So, further question. Get and post store their parameters in different regions of the packet. Where do get parameters get stored?
The header.
1, 2, 3,
The header.
in the header. That's right. So get parameters get stored in the header. Thus, they are unencrypted. Post parameters in the 1, 2, 3 payload. Very good. Post. There we go. So, if you are sending information which is in any way sensitive, you are sending it by post, not using get parameters. So, for example, if we had a fetch request that was actually a login request, and we were attaching our username and login here, that would constitute a fairly major security breach. You essentially don't even have a password login system anymore if you do that, right? So, does that make sense? Any questions? Okay. I will consider that topic closed. So, I think I'm going to leave Bootstrap. I forget who said Bootstrap. I think we're going to we'll leave that for just we'll put that on the back burner for the moment. Don't worry, we will get to it. But let's talk JSON. I think it makes sense to like go through the HTML and CSS portions in module 1 before we get to Bootstrap. Do those in order. We absolutely will get to Bootstrap though. But let's talk about JSON. So, first and foremost, what does JSON stand for? 1, 2, 3.
JavaScript string object notation?
Well, the S actually stands for script. So it's JavaScript object notation. Very good. So, there we go. So JavaScript object notation is a way of taking nested data structures and storing them as strings. As we know about network traffic, we are, in general, throwing strings around, right? If you were to look at the payload of most internet packets, you will see that they are character encoded string data. It doesn't make sense to send all of this data, like data structures themselves, in the form of like binary data. It doesn't really make sense to do that within the context of the internet. You're going to have to do enough work to them anyways that you might as well send them character encoded, basically. So, with JSON, there are two important methods in JavaScript for encoding a data structure as JSON and decoding a data structure from JSON. Does anybody remember what they are?
Stringify?
Stringify. JSON.stringify, to be precise, takes a data structure and produces JSON. What is the one that does it the other way? How do we go from JSON to a data structure?
Decode?
Not decode. Not in JavaScript.
Encode?
Nope.
Parse?
Parse. Yes. JSON.parse. JSON.parse takes JSON encoded strings and converts them to a data structure. So that's how it works on the client side. On the server side, if we're talking about PHP, we have two functions which do the same thing. They are JSON underscore decode and JSON underscore encode. So decode works the same as parse. Encode works the same as stringify. Honestly, I rather vastly prefer PHP's terminology. The word stringify just is irksome to me. So, okay, that's how you encode and decode JSON. I will say parenthetically, if you're using an AJAX request, and in that middle then call, you are using the JSON decoder, you're actually saying, just do this please without me having to call it explicitly, and it does. The data you will receive afterwards has already been decoded from string into data structure. It saves you the step of calling JSON.parse. But that's about the extent of it. Make sense?
So you're saying the dot then function automatically does the parse? Or?
Yes, but only if you do it this way. Then response.json. If you do .json instead of .text, the essentially the only difference there is that you're saying, okay, please call this when you're finished. Whereas if you use .text, it doesn't. And once we get into server side, you'll find a thing that happens quite frequently is you think you are sending JSON because you're using JSON decode or encode, or you're using JSON encode in like one area of your PHP script, but something else is writing into the response packet as well. So you'll end up with malformed JSON because it'll be like, you'll end up with something like, oh, JSON string, but before that is appended like, hello, because you like have a leftover print statement, right? This bit here will cause the JSON parse to fail because that ain't JSON, right? Make sense? So, in terms of like the way that JSON is structured, the way that the data structure itself is structured, at the top level, you have one of two things. You have either a list or an object, right? Objects are composed of key-value pairs and are addressed by keys. Lists are arrays. They are just a list of things. You address them by number. Each element within any of these data structures can be this one, or an integer, or a double, or a string, or a Boolean. All of your basic data types, right? So I can have something like array, potato, 5, true, object, A gets apple. I think you have to put quotes in it in JSON. O gets orange. And that's what JSON can look like. Often the structure is a bit more regular than this, but it doesn't have to be. The purpose with which JSON was originally designed was as a way to take an object in JavaScript, package up all of its properties in some kind of data format, and be able to send that to another program as a string so that it could be decoded and an object constructed from it. Right? That's why it's called object notation. The original design impetus of JSON was, I got a program over here with objects with nice data. I got a program over there that needs that data. Maybe I can have some kind of data format, take an object over here and send it by string to that program over there. That's what JSON, that's the problem that JSON is solving. It just so happens that in the case of the web applications we're learning this semester and next, the program over here that has the nice data could be either JavaScript on the client side or PHP on the server side, and the program it's communicating with is either PHP on the server side or JavaScript on the client side, respectively. Right? That transfer of the string occurs over the internet. Does that make sense? Any questions? Any follow-up questions on the subject of JSON? Cool. All right. We will call JSON complete then. Wonderful. Does anybody have the time?
10:43.
Cool. All right. So, anything in particular for the person who wanted Bootstrap talked about? Anything in particular about Bootstrap? Who was that anyway? I forgot. Don't tell me someone asked for a topic and then left. No? Okay. Well, the grid system was a fairly meaty example. We should probably also talk about responsive design. There we go. So, the reason that this is sitting here, you may have forgotten it, but there is a module 0 document in the getting started module on Canvas, which has a small amount of information in it, but still very useful and important information. So, I'm going to use it to kind of leap off into a discussion, a review of how it is that the browser works with respect to loading all of this code. So, all right. You got your client. You got your server. Client-server communication. Who initiates it? What percentage of the time is it the client? Trick question. It's 100%. 100% of the time, it is the client who requests from the server. The server has no ability, zero, none, no ability to reach out into the internet and contact a client. It doesn't happen ever. There are certain very important results that will derive from this, particularly as we get into server-side next semester, but that is the basis on which we start this discussion. The client always starts by talking to the server. Communication always originates in the client. That being said, the server always gets the last word, right? So the client sends a request packet, the server sends a response packet. So, kind of leaving aside AJAX and the idea of internet as API, if we think about Web Classic, what is a request for? What are we requesting? What is the object of our request?
File request, so the HTML.
Very good. So requests are a request you should think of as being short for request for remote resource, right? So in Web Classic, when we send a request, we are requesting an HTML page, CSS, JavaScript, image files, music files, but in all cases a file. With recent developments in APIs, this is becoming less and less the case, as I demonstrated in class, but it's important to understand that the API layer has been built on top of the infrastructure that was originally designed as nothing more than a file server, right? So, the file server functionality of the internet, that's your baseline, right? That is the basic operation mode. What does HTTP stand for? Ooh, sounds like a few people know it. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Hypertext Transfer Protocol, very good. So, hypertext, text, string, file, so you also have FTP, which is File Transfer Protocol, right? More general protocol. HTTP was originally designed to transfer specifically hypertext. What does HTML stand for? Hypertext Markup Language. So, the HTTP protocol was designed to transfer HTML, right? So, okay, sure, fine. Good. So, once the browser receives an HTML file from the server, how does it process it?
Line by line from top to bottom.
Line by line from top to bottom. Very good. So it starts at the top. First thing it processes is doc type, then HTML, head, all of the stuff in your head, body, all of the stuff in your body. Not your physical body. You know what I mean. So, here's a question. What happens when the browser hits something like link rel style sheet source mystyles.css?
Request instead of new request or
It does. So the browser is not pre-scanning the HTML to load the resources that it needs. It goes out and fetches the resources as they appear in the file, right? So, when the browser parses the line where the CSS is loaded, that triggers the request for the CSS file. It goes out, it talks to the server, it gets the CSS file back. When it receives it, it processes it. Right? How about JavaScript? Same process. When the browser hits a script tag, and that script tag is calling for an exterior JavaScript file, the browser stops interpreting the HTML. It says, okay server, I need a JavaScript file now. The server's like, here you go. The browser says, yes, thank you for the JavaScript file, and then it proceeds to process the JavaScript file. How does how does the browser process a JavaScript file? Also one line at a time, yes. So you can almost think of the process as, let's say that we have the JavaScript console, clunk, like a big typewriter in front of us, right? The server sends us our JavaScript. We feed that into the JavaScript console, and we press execute, and it pulls that piece of paper in one line at a time. Process. Fundamentally, the same, like the JavaScript interpreter, with the same process which is sitting behind the JavaScript console is the thing crunching all of this data in, right? So, we're loading the JavaScript one line at a time, executing it line by line. So the consequence of this is that JavaScript gets executed at the time when the browser loads the script element, right? This has a necessary side effect. If your JavaScript is looking for things that haven't been loaded yet, it's not going to find them. The most particular example of this is DOM elements. So we, because of good practice, load our scripts in the head of the document. The head is processed before the body, because it appears higher in the file. The elements of the body are therefore not loaded at the time when your JavaScript is loaded and executed. This means that if you have lines of JavaScript which are simply trying to access DOM elements, they will fail. They will return null because the elements you're looking for do not exist yet. So, to solve this problem, you have three mechanisms. The first is to hide everything that asks for a DOM resource inside of a function, right? Functions, as we all know, are not executed until they are called, right? We load a function definition, we call it later. The later will most of the time be after the DOM has been loaded, because you will be calling it typically from an event listener attached to some HTML object, an on-click attribute, something like that, right? The user is not going to click anything on the page before the page has even loaded, right? So that's number one, hide everything in functions. Sometimes you can't hide everything in functions though, sometimes you need global references to DOM elements, or at least it's useful, right? I guess technically you never need it, but like it's every time you call query selector, you are doing a search operation. If your website is large, that can take time, right? So the second way, right? The second way is to use the window load event. The window load event only triggers after the DOM has been loaded. Therefore, anything that you put inside of window load will not execute until the DOM is loaded. Therefore, if you go looking for references, you will find them. Make sense? So that's the other way. This is kind of the preferred way that we have in the course materials for doing this. So there's a third way that we didn't discuss in class, yet it appeared in a few people's assignments, so I'm assuming people are using, resources outside of the text of the material to complete assignments. But did you know that scripts have a defer tag, a defer attribute? Pardon me. So kind of in the same way that with an input, you can say, like, you have an attribute checked, which like doesn't have any, there's no equals, right? It's just checked is there or it isn't. It's kind of a Boolean, right? You have an attribute called defer, which you can put inside of script elements that will defer them until the whole thing has been loaded. Now, this seems like the hip, young, modern way of doing things, and it indicates to me that probably the course materials are in desperate need of updating. I would like to emphasize, I do not have anything against the defer attribute, right? Although I was kind of annoyed when I saw it in people's assignments, but my annoyance is not always like the reason you lose marks on things. I can be annoyed at something and still give you full marks for it, right? Because it is like current and correct JavaScript, right? It's just kind of annoying to me that I learned about this through students' assignment submissions rather than the course materials which I've inherited, right? Which realistically should have contained this information. In the future, they will. To the extent that we're going to do JavaScript at all, which of course we'll have to, but I kind of want to convert the whole course to a combination of. I've settled in my brain. I want to change this course to like be 50% TypeScript and 50% React, and I want to steal an hour from like one of the other courses in second semester. Because come on, you guys know, React is actually essential knowledge, I would say, and we have to get React into you guys before we send you out on co-op. I think that's fairly clear, but nevertheless, so that's the third way of doing it, is using the defer attribute. Anybody who gives me any one of those three answers, to a question that asks about this, not that I'm saying there is one, but either one of those would be acceptable, right? I'm not gonna, if it's correct, then it's worth marks, even if it wasn't in the course material explicitly, basically. That being said, use the course materials as your primary resource, even if, there are certain age-related problems with them. So, does that make sense? Good. So that's how the thing loads stuff. That's also how clients and servers work. So let's talk about, oh, there you are. Thank you. Let's talk about the document object model. Incidentally, I'm proceeding with this review session on the theoretical assumption that it is of more value to review things that we did 3 months ago than things we did 1 month ago. So that's why I'm starting where I stood. That's why I started where I did. So the document object model has been a fairly, you couldn't avoid it this semester. There was no way of doing anything without having to do, pulling references from the DOM, or attaching event listeners to things in the DOM. Those two particular operations I'm not going to review on the assumption that each of you have done that to death over the course of all your assignments, right? Unless you've had the accursed chatbot generate all of your assignments for you, in which case, you've kind of made your own bed and now you're going to lie in it on the exam. So, the document object model. The previous discussion kind of leaves off something important, or begs a very important question. We talked about how HTML is loaded by the browser, right? The order and the manner in which the browser parses these files. What we did not discuss is what does it parse them into, right? What does the data look like once the browser has finished reading and loading it? That is the document object model. So, the document object model is a tree. Does anybody know what a tree is? I'm not talking about biological trees. Good grief. Hopefully you all know what a biological tree is. Does anybody know what the tree data structure is?
We've got a parent node at the top and then child nodes going down and child nodes.
Yeah, just like an ever-expanding field of children as you go down, right? So, yes, in general, with respect to the document object model, the root node of the tree is the document object, which you may always assume to be in existence. The browser will always initialize a document, right? Within that, the subnodes or the child nodes of the tree are things, basically all of the things inside of the file, right? Doc type, HTML, head, body, maybe a meta, maybe a script, H2, div, paragraph, 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 H6. I don't really understand the existence of H6. Because the text is smaller than a paragraph text. How does that constitute a heading? It's very strange. Anyway. So, this is a tree. You probably will discuss trees a little bit when you talk about data structures and algorithms. A bit. But a tree is a specific type of a general form of data structure known as a graph. Graphs are collections of edges and vertices. These are the edges, these are the vertices. You may also call the vertices nodes. In trees, the terminology, if you're not talking parent-child, you're talking branch and leaf. So anything with children is a branch node. Anything with no children is a leaf node. That's kind of, okay. What do you call a collection of disjoint trees? Yeah, you actually do. In formal mathematics, they call a collection of trees a forest. There you go. So, terminology. You have the root node. There's an implied direction on all of these, right? It doesn't really matter if you make all of the arrows go up or down, right? Either parents point at their children or children point to their parent, right? There are a couple of properties that make this a tree, right? Number one, every node in the tree has exactly one parent, except for the root node, which has no parents, right? So, let me ask you a question. Is this still a tree? You see the arrow I added? Is this still a tree? How many people think yes? How many people think no? No is correct. If there was another arrow here, this H2 element would have two parents. But every node in a tree has exactly one parent. So, you know, unlike human beings which typically have two parents, you know, with one notable exception 2,000 years ago. So that's one. The other is this still a tree? Because now it's the case that, like, we have not violated the property that every node have at most one, or have, yeah, at most one parent, right? All we've done is added something which cycles back to the beginning of the data structure. Is this still a tree? How many people think yes? How many people think no? No is correct. Another property of trees is that they are acyclic. That is, they do not contain cycles. This is a cycle, right? In graph theory, we call that a cycle. So, trees aren't allowed to have those either. If you take a tree and you constrain the number of children that each parent is permitted to have, you get different varieties of tree. If you constrain the number of children to at most 2, what do you end up with? A binary tree. And binary trees are very important in, like, mathematics and data structures and algorithms. So, this is a tree. The tree is hierarchical. The structure of HTML is also hierarchical. This is a good representation. Does this make sense? You can access the various elements by navigating through the tree, right? If I wanted to, I could arrive at this paragraph here by saying, document child 1, child 1, child 1, child 0, right? You can also get from here to here by calling parent twice, right? Most of the time, however, we don't do things that way. We use searching functions. We use query selector because if we base our DOM navigation on the positions of elements in the page, if somebody comes along and adds, like an H3 here, suddenly we are no longer referencing the thing that we thought we were. Any modifications to the HTML page will instantaneously break our JavaScript, assuming they have added even one element, right? That's not a situation you want to be in. That makes the code very fragile, right? So instead we use query selector, which is a searching operation. I believe it's depth first search, and it searches left branches first. So, if you're interested in the algorithm. So, quick note, we don't use getElementById, we use query selector. It is very probable that in future editions of JavaScript, getElementById will probably be deprecated. You should consider it a legacy method at this point, right? Basically, query selector does everything that it does everything that suite of methods did, and more, right? Because you can use general CSS selectors, which are more descriptive than, getElementById, getElementByClass, you can run things together, right? Like with a CSS selector, you can say, I want all divs with this class. Whereas getElementByClass, it's like, okay, of those, now I have to get the elements by ID, or get my elements by the element type. So, query selector is more flexible, it does more with less, and it's nice and perfect and beautiful. And so that's why. Now, there are two variants, query selector and query selector all. Query selector grabs a reference to one element. Query selector all grabs a reference to every element matching the query, right? And returns a list, and then you have to pick through it yourself. Does that make sense? Any questions? Any questions about the DOM? Yeah? Okay. Is this good review so far? Are you guys enjoying this? Okay. Okay. So, with respect to CSS then, I will ask a question. With CSS animations, you have been required to do this at several points throughout the course for assignments. Is it useful to do one, or shall we skip it in the interests of getting to things that might be more useful? How many people want to go in? If even one person wants to see CSS animations, I'll do it. But if the unanimous consensus of the class is that we skip it, then we shall do so. Does anybody want to see CSS animations?
If it's gonna be on the test, sure.
Yeah. All right, well, I'll count that as a yes vote. So, although I will neither confirm nor deny whether CSS animations are on the test, however, I will say that you did have to do it quite a bit, didn't you? You know? As predicting what's going to be on the test goes, stuff that you were required to do many times over the course of several assignments is, you know, it increases the probability, let's just say. So, CSS animation then. The type of CSS animation that we learned in class was keyframe animation. The syntax for it was as follows. You have at keyframes, or possibly without the S. You select a name for the animation, and then you specify a number of percentages. These percentages are the percentage of the total duration of the animation at which this keyframe occurs. So something typical would be like, 0%, 20%, 100%. It's important to include the 100% if you want the animation to loop back around smoothly to its original state. Otherwise, it will just, basically, if this is missing, then it will hold the state it's at, whatever state you give it, at 20% until the end of the animation. And then, if once it reaches time 100%, it will go back to 0 with no transition, no smooth transition. So the 100% at the end should be identical to the 0%. It should be the same set of attributes if you want the animation to loop smoothly, which you generally will if you want it to loop at all, right? So, after this, you specify what are essentially compact CSS rule bodies with no selectors, right? So we can say stuff like color, chartreuse, color, what's a good one? Azure blue, sure. And again, this one should be the same as the 0%. Make sense? Incidentally, I would never, ever, ever recommend using these colors on text. Although possibly on a black background these would be readable, but certainly never make your text chartreuse on a white background. That is, man, back in my days as a part-time instructor at McMaster University, the teaching materials I received varied greatly in quality, and one semester the teaching materials that I had, the previous part-timer had used, the text, like the regular body text in this stupid PowerPoint presentation, all of these stupid PowerPoint presentations, was literally lime green on white. And I took that as you have no idea what you're doing, and therefore all of the information in this is bunk anyways, so I should just throw out all of your slides, start over from fresh. And I did. And it was beautiful and glorious. There we go. That was a second year C programming course, and you can the videos for that are still on the YouTube channel. If you want, you can go take a look. I probably complain about the slides like in the first couple of lectures of the first year that I teach that, so you can tell how much I've been scarred by them. So anyway, that's how you set up a keyframe animation. Setting up the animation is one thing. Applying the animation, that's another thing. We require a regular CSS rule in order to do so. There are a couple of fields which you can use. So it's like in the case of animation, you have the same option that you do with border or a couple of other different ones. You know how like when we do border, we typically do border 2-pixel solid black or something like that, right? You have the same ability with animation. You can specify like what order, like you can do it all in one line by just saying animation. For teaching purposes, I will most of the time break these into their individual properties because I think that's a bit easier to remember, right? What at the very least, like the properties say what they are, right? So it's easier to remember them. But they are animation dash name, animation dash duration, animation dash iteration count. There are a couple of other ones like the timing function, but you know, you guys can look that up. These are the basics. Animation name must match the name that you gave your keyframe animation. Simple enough. Animation duration is the amount of time in seconds which the animation is to occur over. This is absolutely necessary information, as otherwise how are you going to calculate when these keyframes should happen? So let's say 5 seconds. You should give a number which is a period of time. Animation iteration count is the number of times to loop the animation. If the animation should be looped for X number of times and then stop, you put that number here. If you want the animation to loop forever, you can also specify infinite, which makes it loop forever. Make sense? So far so good? Good. So that we will call that CSS animation. Good. So now let's talk about CSS selector specificity. Also selector priority. So it is important to understand the nature of conflict between CSS rules. My general attitude towards conflict between CSS rules is that if you are designing your CSS rules such that they contain conflict, you should probably think about doing it some other way, you know? Like the easiest way to avoid having to know all of the rules relating to CSS conflicts is to simply write CSS that doesn't conflict, right? Write your rules such that they are mutually exclusive, right? They do not apply to the same sets of objects. That being said, what does CSS stand for? Cascading style sheets. So what does cascading mean?
Go from parent element to the child element.
It means it's essentially referring to the conflict resolution mechanism, right? So let's imagine that we have two rules which apply to the same object. Div and div. Color, ghost white. Color, our ever favorite, peach puff. Border, 2 pixels, solid, black. Display, block, margin, auto. So, one very important thing to understand about CSS. Conflicts are determined on a property by property basis. So, with these two CSS rules, both of these rules are writing to the color property, but both of these rules are writing to other properties as well. If we call this Rule 1 and Rule 2, Rule 1 is writing to border, Rule 2 is writing to display and margin. There's nothing in Rule 1 which conflicts with display and margin. There is nothing in Rule 2 which conflicts with border. In the end, all of the divs will pick up each of these 3 properties as they are given. They are not in conflict. There is one property, however, that is in conflict. Color. Right? So, the conflict arbitration mechanism will apply only to the color property. Another way of saying this is that CSS rules do not cancel out other CSS rules. CSS properties can cancel out CSS properties, but they are not evaluated on a sort of whole rule chunk basis. Does that make sense? Maybe? A little bit? Wow. So, the question now becomes, what do we do when properties are in conflict? There are a couple of things to look at. First, where these rules originate gets taken into account, right? There's a whole list of these things. You've basically got CSS rules which can originate from 3 sources. You, the author of the web app, the user who loads the web app, and the browser, right? Generally, your CSS rules will take precedence over the other 2, unless important tags are involved, in which case that ordering gets reversed. And everything with an important tag takes priority over everything without an important tag. Generally, if you're using important tags, you're probably doing it wrong. You should try to avoid them most of the time. They can be tricky. Generally, it's like the important tag is the last refuge of the designer who doesn't understand how CSS works a lot of the time. Sometimes you just can't avoid them, but most of the time you're just trying to kind of sledgehammer your way through, it's like, if CSS is like this this delicate balancing act of, wine glasses on trays all over the place, then your important tag is just a hammer. So, assuming that the rules originate in the same place and have the same level of importance, the next thing that's examined is the number of IDs in the selector. So CSS selectors can have more than one thing in them, right? We can have things like div.class or div.foo, right? We can have p-id bar. In theory, IDs are supposed to uniquely identify elements, so like in theory you shouldn't need anything other than an ID, but this is still allowed for something with multiple IDs. So basically, you take your CSS selector, you tally up the number of IDs it contains, and whoever has the most wins. Otherwise, if they both have the same number of IDs, the next thing you look at is the number of classes. Whoever has more classes wins the conflict. Assuming there are the same number of classes, we then look at elements. Whoever has the most elements then wins. Now, in terms of like the way this algorithm works on the inside, this thing gets multiplied by like 100, this gets multiplied by 10,000, and they all get added together, and then you're just doing like regular integer comparison, right? So in theory, if you have enough elements, you can override classes and like increase the class count by 1 or 2. But like, if like, realistically speaking, if you are writing a CSS selector with several hundred elements, one must ask the question, how many elements HTML even defines, right? Like, there's a point at which you're becoming ridiculous. So effectively, you examine IDs, then you examine classes, then you examine rules, or elements. And if everything is still the same, as it is in this case, the rule that was loaded most recently wins. So in this case, the one that's further down the file. Does that make sense? Any questions? I will speak briefly on the subject of quote-unquote fancy CSS selectors. So these are things like pseudo classes. The most, like the kind of the hello world of pseudo classes is hover, right? If you've got your mouse pointer over it, you can activate a CSS rule for it, right? So that's a pseudo class. Pseudo elements have 2 colons, and they are things like first dash line, right? We are selecting sub-elements of an element that aren't like explicit sub-elements according to HTML, right? Nowhere in HTML is first line like defined or laid out, right? This is a decision that CSS is making about a paragraph, where the first line is. That being said, these can be extremely useful because if it was your object to do something different with the first line of a paragraph, doing that using JavaScript and HTML would be a royal pain in the keister. Because, like, how do you actually know when a word in a paragraph has entered the next line? This is dynamic on the width of the containing box, right? It is dynamic on the size of the font. It is dynamic on, like, what the characters actually are in a non-proportional font, which most fonts are non-proportional fonts. It's a bloody nightmare. So, pseudo elements. Those are good. Another one which is useful is the attribute selector. So you can go through the attributes of elements looking for elements with attributes with specific values. So, for example, if I wanted to say image where source is equal to happy.png, this selects not all of my images, but only those images which are displaying this particular image file. And that's actually quite useful, especially if you consider these are CSS selectors, so you can use that with query selector in JavaScript as well. Does this make sense? Any questions?
What was the third one called?
Oh, this is an attribute selector. Okay. So it's 11:38. I think that it's probably time to break for our first break. Let's break for the only break you're getting. Second breakfast, yeah. All right, please be ready to resume class at, let's see, 11:53. Thank you very much. There we go. Okay, Bootstrap, responsive design, what is it? Somebody tell me.
It's a framework that you can pull from like an external resource that simplifies CSS for you.
That is a description of Bootstrap, yes. So what is responsive design? Yes?
Isn't it something to allow websites to adapt to different screen sizes or?
Precisely so. So it's more of a design methodology than any specific library. So back in the old days, when phones were first coming on the scene, it was very common to just kind of ignore the problem of how bad your website looked on a phone, right? Then, as phones became increasingly popular and, better and more, faster and all the rest of it, people started using them more and more to view websites. There was a period we went through where the server would read the incoming packet to determine what, the operating system was, and then send, a version of the website based on that operating system. So, if you were logging in with a particular phone, it would send you the phone's version of the website. This, of course, was a ridiculous explosion in complexity. So responsive design is the principle where we cycle through different layouts for the website based on the screen width of the device that it's being viewed on. And we are issuing one version of the website, not multiple versions of the website, right? So one version to rule them all, one version to find them, one version to bring them all, and adjust itself according to their screen widths. All right? So, So that's responsive design generally. What is it called when you switch from one layout to another? This is also a term that's used in debugging.
Breakpoint?
Breakpoint, yes. So a breakpoint is a screen width that is the boundary between two different layouts, right? So most common one, in phones you will often stack things vertically because you don't have that much width. On a desktop, you have things spread out in columns, sidebars, and that sort of thing. The transition point between that sidebar layout and the stacked layout is the breakpoint. Make sense? Any questions? Okay. So, now a major example that we used of Bootstrap is the Bootstrap grid system. Oh, perhaps we should say, how do you get Bootstrap in the first place? There are two ways. How do you do it?
The content delivery network.
Content delivery network is one.
And then you can download it locally.
You can download it locally. That's two, right? They both are, they both are different in different ways. You should read it when you're studying. What was I saying? Lost my train of thought. Content delivery network. So how do you actually use Bootstrap? Like in terms of syntax, what do you do?
So, link.
No, I mean like, how do you style an element in your page? What do you do in Bootstrap?
You write classes.
You include your elements in a set of predefined classes as given in the Bootstrap documentation, right? So, Bootstrap has a very important example in the Bootstrap grid system, which is an integration of CSS grid and Flexbox in one thing, right? So, the way that you create a Bootstrap grid is as follows. You have a div with class container. I'm going to abbreviate things slightly. Inside of that, you have a div of class row. You have in there div of class column and div of class column and div and div and div. Right? So the Bootstrap grid system operates on a division of 12 columns, right? So you have 12 individual columns in the Bootstrap grid system. By assigning a number to any particular column, you can force one of these divs to occupy a specific number of these columns. So for example, if I said column -9, it would say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's our division. So in this, you end up with a main body and a right sidebar. Now, some of you mathematical perfectionists might be saying to yourselves, well, if I have 12 columns in total and this one occupies 9 of them, it therefore follows that this one occupies 3, so that I should write that in, right? This is in fact optional. What happens is any columns which are not, that do not have their width specified, they share the remaining space equally. So, for example, if I had 2 of these, and let's say I had 8 here, just to make the math a little easier. these two columns would share the remaining space and divide it between themselves equally. If you want to constrain that, you can, but you can also just leave it like that. Another important thing to note about Flexbox, about Bootstrap Grid System, is that you can make it adjust to a stacked layout by specifying breakpoints. The way that you specify a breakpoint in Bootstrap is by using a breakpoint suffix. This is a column width suffix. The breakpoint suffixes in Bootstrap are things like small, medium, large, extra large. I think there's an extra large as well. So you slap one of these on here, and it configures it so that it will swap to a stacked configuration at the specified breakpoint. Make sense? Any questions? Okay. Shall we talk about JavaScript then? Does anybody have any questions, though? If anybody has any questions, I will gladly answer any questions you have. So let's talk, first of all, about JavaScript basics. What do I mean by basics? I mean basically, how does the type system work? So, fill in the blank. JavaScript is a blank typed language. Options are weakly or strongly. How many people think that JavaScript is a strongly typed language? Weakly typed language. Very good. What does it mean to be weakly typed?
You don't have to declare the type. Like it'll kind of just use it.
No. That's dynamic typing. Weak typing means that we've got these two things to worry about and the distinction between them. So, if a language is weakly typed, basically that means it has two equality comparison operators. A weak one, and a strong one. So, we have weak equality and we have strong equality. Under weak equality, you get away with all kinds of stuff, like this. This is true under weak equality, right? So what weak equality is really doing is, under the hood, it performs implicit type conversion to attempt to determine whether something is true or false. This is not great. it results in a lot of weird results, such as the following, which is my favorite of all of the strange results of JavaScript. Yes. Right? I showed you this one, right? So there's this really important result in mathematics where like if something is equal to something else and logical operator, and that thing it's equal to is equal to some third thing, you can therefore conclude that the first thing is equal to the third thing. It's called the transitive property. It doesn't hold for a weak equality under JavaScript, which is strange to say the least. This, if we took all of these and slapped the extra equal sign on them, then it's fine because all of that comes out false, right? The difference between weak and strong equality is that strong equality will look at the typing first, and if the typing doesn't match, it says that's not the same thing. Under weak equality, you have to, like this is a problem, but it's also a problem because those things will also equate to the following. Null, undefined, not a number, and I think occasionally empty things might also compare this way in some circumstances. I forget the extent how that extends in that direction, but just put those in that category as well, right? So it's worth reviewing all of these. What is null?
That's supposed to be like a memory address that is empty.
A memory address that's empty? That's a pretty good statement.
Empty references.
Yeah, it's like, in theory, this thing doesn't exist, but it does because it's a literal, right? It's a literal for a thing that doesn't exist. Now, the sorts of operations you can perform to get null include trying to query select something that's not in the DOM. You'll get null if you try to look for a DOM element that doesn't exist, right? So, when particular types of operations fail, null is the result. How about undefined? When does undefined pop up?
You are trying to get something, like for example, an element, a number from an array, but the index is out of bounds.
Oh, interesting. That's a.
Yeah, instead, it doesn't say there is an error, it just say it's undefined, that's all.
Well, as bad as that is, it's still better than C. Not that JavaScript is in any way better than C, but you know, in C that it just literally just reads the cell and gives you its value. Like that is at least some form of bounds checking, and C doesn't do any bounds checking at all. Yeah, I know, right? So basically in C, if you have a memory address for an array, and you like read all of the contents of the array and keep reading, you will just read all of the memory cells that come after the array. This can include other arrays, other variables, and eventually, if you keep doing it, the operating system says, listen, I gave you this much memory, you're trying to read outside the memory I gave you, so seg fault, and then it kills your program. And that's what a segmentation fault is you're trying to read outside of the memory that you were given. Most commonly, you get that from trying to dereference a null pointer, or a pointer that points to the first cell in memory. Anyway, yeah, okay. Another place that you get undefined is when a function does not have a return statement, it returns undefined. So these things are used for kind of weird errors. If you, like, one thing you could think of undefined as being is like a void literal. You know, like anytime you have the void data type in something like Java, what does that mean? What does void mean in Java?
It just doesn't return anything.
It doesn't return anything, right? So JavaScript, like, you don't declare something as not returning anything, it just doesn't return anything, and the thing that it doesn't return is the undefined literal, right? You see why I hate this language, right? How about not a number? How do you get that?
You try to learn forward a string, one number, but the function doesn't identify the string as a possible.
Sure. If you try to perform like number conversion on something that's not a number, you get not a number. Another way is if you try to perform arithmetic operations on things that are not of numeric type. So maybe your expression is like false plus potato. You would get not a number. Does that make sense? Oh, maybe we want to slap this on as well. You also have infinity, which is kind of almost like being not a number, but like JavaScript also has an infinity literal, which you get instead of zero division, I'm pretty sure. Like instead of crashing on zero division, it gives you the infinity literal. I'm pretty sure. I'm like, somebody try that in console, but I'm almost certain that that's correct. So yeah, basically, anytime any sane language would give you an exception, JavaScript tries to give you one of a handful of error literals and just carry those through the calculation, because that makes sense, right? Good. Okay, so what does dynamic typing mean?
But you doesn't have to specify the type of like just state as
Yeah.
it is.
You don't have to specify the data type of variables. Notice when we declare variables using let, var, or const, right? When we declare variables in JavaScript, we do not specify a data type like we do in Java. The data type is determined from the thing you are assigning to it at the time you are assigning to it. This is the type of thing that I'm talking about when I say JavaScript only has one type and that type is garbage. Okay, here's one for you. Here's one for you. I'm going to give you two numbers. You're going to tell me what type they are. What type is this?
The number, yeah.
Yeah. What type is this?
Number.
Also a number. Yeah. In a normal language, you would say this is an int, and this is float or double. Double, by the way, stands for double precision floating point number, if you didn't know that already. Not in JavaScript. Both of these are number. Even though they're not actually. The CPU certainly doesn't think there's no difference between an integer and a blah. But at the same time, JavaScript also doesn't recognize the existence of characters as a separate data type. So, yeah, in JavaScript, integers and floats are collected under one data type called number, it doesn't stop them from having functions for parsing both int and double. Clearly, there's a difference, JavaScript, but no! Alright, hopefully that's something that TypeScript fixes. I haven't looked into it. Good grief. Let's see here. Other JavaScript basics. In terms of like the brass tacks of syntax, as it were, if statements, loops generally work the way that you expect them to from Java or sane languages. I recently discovered that at some point JavaScript added support for like for each loops that look like Java for each loops and everybody else's for each loops, so you don't have to actually use the for each method. You can just do it properly in the language now, which is possibly also a way that the slides need to be updated. So there you go, for each loops, you can use those in JavaScript now. The syntax is like roughly approximate to the way it works in Java. I think it's like for thing as other thing. The only difference, of course, is you're not declaring a type, right? So, also pretty much the same as things work in PHP. Okay. Can we move on to functions? So, let's discuss overloading. Overloading is a form of polymorphism. You will have seen overloading in Java. Here's a little review for your Java exam. You will have seen overloading in Java in the context. Like the example they use is overloading constructors, right? You define the constructor like a million times with a slightly different arguments each time, which allows you to construct the object using different sets of arguments. Overloading in Java. Because it's Java, everything takes forever to write. Overloading in Java script. Let's imagine we have the following function. Very nominal function. So, if I call this add 3, what happens? The result is not a number. That's true. The 3 gets bound to the x. What gets bound to the y?
No.
Not null, but you're on the right track. Undefined. That's right. Because an argument was not provided, y gets undefined. 3 plus undefined is not a number. The return result is not a number. Make sense? So we have one way to counteract this, and that is to assign default arguments, default values to arguments. if we configure things thus, with a little equals 0 inside of the declaration line of the function, rather than defaulting to undefined, it will default to the value specified, which is 0. We then have 0 plus 3, which gives 3. 0 plus 3 is 0 plus 3 is
3.
Thank you. Good grief.
This is JavaScript, sir. Weird things.
I know, this I know, I've just been, like, I just described every possible exception to normal math, and then I expected you to do normal math, right? So let's consider the following case. So, add 5, 10, and 15. New color. 5 will be bound to x. 10 will be bound to y. What will happen to 15? Because it's not an error. That's what happens to 15. It literally gets thrown in the trash. It goes to that great memory cell in the sky. It goes to dev/null, which is Linux speak for the afterlife. That's where all unnecessary log statements go. So, this guy is thrown in the bin. And this is the way that a real language that is the most popular programming language in the world works. So, yeah, any questions about that? Good. So, let's talk about anonymous functions. So, with anonymous functions, first of all, well, I should preface this. It is impossible to be an effective JavaScript programmer without using anonymous functions. They are necessary knowledge, right? The alternative is to declare each function as its own function with its own body and then pass references to all of these functions. But this is not the way that code is most of the time written. You often in JavaScript want a function that's only used once when you are setting up event listeners, right? And other times that your functions expect a function as an argument, you will use an anonymous function. Ooh, that's one actually. Functional. Should talk about that. So, anonymous functions in JavaScript come in two main varieties. You have your regular function declaration syntax, you just don't specify a name. In class, I have been referring to these as anonymous functions. And then you also have these guys. It seems that the JavaScript community likes to refer to these as arrow functions, but I have a PhD and I say they're called lambda functions. So there you have it. In terms of the difference between these two, one is by default configured for statements, the other is by default configured for expressions. But either one of these can do the other's job. So to some, there's kind of a bit of a movement towards dropping the longer one in favor of the shorter one because it's shorter, right? It's an abbreviation. Like this guy often gets used as an abbreviation for this guy, right? Because all you have to do is throw the mustaches up, and suddenly you can now put statements inside of this, because this is now a code block. Do you guys know the difference between statements and expressions? Anybody? This is certainly something you should have learned in fundamentals, as it is, you might say, fundamental. Alright, you mind if we take a very brief digression? Alright, so the best way to understand the difference between a statement and an expression is to pull on your knowledge from algebra. That's right, algebra in grade school. So, when you were in grade school, you would have seen something like this on a math test. And it would have said, evaluate the expression. Right? We all know these. A little bit later on, you would have things like this. Equations. What's the difference between an expression and an equation? What does an equation have that an expression doesn't? Aside from variables, variables can also be in expressions.
An equal sign?
An equal sign, yes. Equation. Equals, yes. So equations are, what are we equating? We are saying that one expression equals another expression, right? This is an expression, this is an expression, right? Equations are composed of two expressions separated by an equal sign. There are all kinds of rules of algebra by which you can transform expressions which are on either side of an equal sign. That is generally how grade school algebra works, is learning, I can take this and subtract it on that side. Yes, you can do that. It's an equation, right? So that's the difference between an equation and an expression. Expression, no equal sign. You can evaluate it, right? You can evaluate it down to one term if it doesnn't contain any, as long as it doesn't contain variables that you don't know the value of, right? You can perform variable substitutions to simplify the expression. Simplify the expression is another way that they would often say it. But that's the difference, right? The same distinction exists in programming languages. The expression is something that gets simplified down to a term. The statement, you can think of them more like an operation, right? Assignment is an operation, right? X is equal to 5 plus y. I know that's actually kind of similar to that. Assuming we have a value for y, this is the expression. The expression gets evaluated. then the statement is executed once all expressions have been fully evaluated. That's how it works, right? So, when I say that lambda functions are meant for expressions, I mean that this type of thing is valid. X plus 5y. That is a function. The thing in here does not need to be assignment, right? It does not need to be anything. Well, it needs to be an expression. The expression is evaluated, and the result of that evaluation is the return value of the function. Expressions. We can apply arguments to these things, like so. When you do, this gets applied to that and substituted in, this gets applied to that and substituted in everywhere it occurs, and bada boom, bada bing, you have something you can now evaluate. 1 plus 5 times 2, which is,
11.
thank you, so, make sense? Good? So, anonymous functions are kind of initially designed when you want multiple programming statements. So if you want to throw things in like if statements, while loops, the loop by which you, or the procedure by which you create a new object and add it to the DOM, which requires at least 3 statements. Statements, you can pack them in here. That being said, if all this function does is return some expression, it's basically the same thing as this thing, right? So this guy can do that guy's work, this guy can do that guy's work. This is more compact this is a more compact form, so people are tending to prefer it now. But, so that's anonymous functions. Any questions? Okay. There we go. So, with functions, we often pass functions by reference into other functions. You folks have been doing this quite a lot this semester because this is the operational mechanism of the callback function in JavaScript. When we create an event, we specify a callback function. When we do that, we pass it by reference. So, if I have function callback, as time grows short, I'm going to have less and things are looking more and more pseudocodey. Listener, add event listener, click, sure, whatever, callback. When we provide a function as a reference, we do not include the round braces. The round braces are correctly thought of as a function execution operator. When you include the round braces, you are saying, run this. We don't want to run this, at least not right now. We want to provide it as a reference, so no round braces. Putting it here, call it back, gets executed immediately and once, and not when you click, when the thing starts up. I am absolutely sure that most of you in the course of this course experienced that at least once, right? It's a pretty common mistake. I myself have made that mistake, I think, during lectures for this very course. So you don't want this. Okay. Function references are basically just memory addresses, right? They boil down to a number at the end of the day. Function references can be the return result of functions. You can return a function from a function. You can actually return one of a couple of different functions from a function. So, for example, if I said, right? If I throw in a nice little switch case that switches on these two cases and returns a reference to functions which are defined elsewhere in the program, the return result of this callback function will be a function itself. In which case, if we execute it and provide it a value within this thing right here, the JavaScript will execute the callback function immediately, but the return value will be either add or bubtrap. One of those two now becomes bound as the callback function to the event. Which one? It depends on what the argument was. Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay. Time grows short. We haven't even talked about SVG. So I'm going to briefly talk about the remaining things here. With forms, there is a very important thing to remember about them. The value inside of them is always a string, even if the type is numeric, right? Even if you have like your nice little slider, the value of the value of the value attribute will always be a string, and therefore will always require parsing, right? Parse int, parse float, whatever you want to use, if you expect to do actual math on it, which presumably you do because it's a numeric type. So that's one. Forms. There's also, it's important to understand about forms, now that we have Ajax under our belt. I thought that was the bell to let go of class for a moment. Yeah, that would be nice, right? So with forms, there is a way of preventing them from doing the thing that they normally do when you submit them, which is to reload the page, right? Now that we're in Ajax land, we don't necessarily want to reload the page every time, right? So there are mechanisms for preventing that from happening. Number one, you could just take all the input elements and put them in a div instead of in a form. That would prevent the form submitting because it's not a form anymore. The other way is to set up the forms submit event to call a method of the event object called prevent default. So, of events, like events we've kind of done to death, you know. I'm not sure I have much useful to say about them, aside from you should, if you've done the assignments, then you should be okay. So SVG then, all right? SVG is certainly testable. The three takeaways from that unit. Number one, you need to have the ability to use the SVG elements to construct figures, right? So you need to know how to make a rectangle, you need to know how to make a circle, all of that stuff, right? You need to know how to create and destroy objects dynamically using JavaScript, and you need to know that for both HTML and SVG objects. SVG objects, there are a couple of differences. Does anybody want to remind us what the differences are between creating? Well, okay, first, the procedure for creating a new object. First, you call create element. You specify the element name. Next, you modify any attributes that need to be modified. Since these things come blank, you will probably need to put at least something in it. You know, there's not really much use in a blank HTML element. They need to have something in them, right? Then, finally, you need a reference to the point in the DOM where you want to insert it as a child. And then, you call append child, passing the reference to the newly created object. I should mention, when you create the object, bind it to a variable, right? Preferably a local variable. Does that make sense? Good. So the differences between doing this with HTML and doing this with SVG. In the case of SVG, the browser does not load the definitions for SVG objects by default. You must tell it where to get those definitions. So create element NS takes as its first argument a URL where you go out and you retrieve those definitions. Another consequence of this is that you don't get all of your attributes very nicely tucked into the object as properties of the object, right? You can't use dot syntax to access, like, you know, the width of a rectangle in SVG. You use get attribute and set attribute, right? Which are methods that are getters and setters in a very similar vein to your Java getters and setters. The only thing about them is the first argument is always the name of the property which you are attempting to read or write to. Make sense? Very good. Are there any questions? I think we pretty much covered Ajax already. All of the important stuff anyway. We got 3 minutes.
Will we have to remember, or like on our cheat sheet, write down the actual like URLs where we're supposed to like link for the SVG, the Bootstrap, or all those?
No. Good gravy, no. That would be a waste of your time and mine. I'm going to tell you a secret. I am not, when I get a test in front of me, I am not going to look at the source of that really long URL to import Bootstrap and be like, that 73rd character should have been a hyphen instead of an underscore. 0! Not going to happen. So no, you don't have to write those down. Once again, I am far more concerned that you understand the principles upon which the language operates, rather than these long strings that, honestly, you probably wouldn't even look that up to write it yourself. Like, you just copy it and you paste it in. Like, no, you don't have to know the bootstrap links. Any other questions?
Will the recording of this class be up earlier than usual to help us with our cheat sheets?
Okay. All right, I'll get it up. I'll get it processing. I'll put it through during my lunch hour for you because you asked. And the videos always get published at midnight, so you will. There's a good reason for that actually. It's like YouTube does like auto captioning, and it takes like an kind of a weird amount of time to process. Like when I upload a video initially, like it's the version which is like the version you can watch is like a friggin' like 480p version, and like it then post processes and upscales it to like the high definition variety, but that takes a few hours, and like I'm not gonna wait around for that and then publish it when it's done. So basically I just schedule them all to be released at midnight, and that means that captioning and the high quality version are just there when you look for it. So yeah. Okie dokie. Any other questions? Okay, well, have a good weekend. Happy studying. Please, please, please do make those crib sheets so you can test them out next week. Next week we're having our practice exam. Take her easy, kids.